Get ready for an absolutely mind-blowing story that will completely shatter everything you think you know about the quiet kid sitting in the back of your classroom. Picture this: a seemingly defenseless teenager cornered in a dingy school bathroom. 4 brutal bullies closing in for the most humiliating attack imaginable, ready to force his head into a filthy toilet bowl. What they didn't know was that they were about to mess with someone who could break bones with techniques most people have never even heard of. This is the incredible true story of Marcus Rivera, the silent warrior whose explosive secret turned predators into prey in the most shocking way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The harsh afternoon sun blazed through the grimy windows of Pinewood Valley High School, casting long shadows across the empty second-floor hallway. The final bell had rung 20 minutes ago, and most students had already fled to their after-school activities or part-time jobs. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of janitor's equipment and the occasional slam of a locker door echoing through the corridors. Marcus Rivera walked slowly down the hallway, his worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor beneath his feet. At 17, Marcus had perfected the art of invisibility. Average height, lean build. Dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that helped him avoid eye contact with his classmates. His clothes were clean but clearly secondhand. His sneakers had seen better days, and everything about his appearance screamed, "Don't notice me." But invisibility was a luxury Marcus could rarely afford at Pinewood Valley High, especially when Tyler Blackwood was prowling the halls looking for entertainment. Tyler Blackwood was everything Marcus wasn't: tall, muscular, wealthy, and completely without conscience. The 18-year-old senior had been held back a year, which only added to his intimidating presence among the younger students. His perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive designer clothes, and the latest iPhone Pro in his manicured hands were all symbols of the privilege that came with being the son of Richard Blackwood, Pinewood Valley's most influential real estate developer and city council member. Tyler's crew followed him like a pack of wolves. Devin Walsh, his lieutenant, was nearly as cruel but twice as cunning, always the one whispering poisonous suggestions in Tyler's ear. Brad Hutchinson carried the latest camera equipment, documenting their cruelty for social media likes and shares. Kyle Morrison provided the muscle, his thick arms and vacant stare making him the perfect enforcer for Tyler's twisted games. They had been tracking Marcus for weeks, studying his patterns, learning his schedule, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tyler's obsession with the quiet scholarship kid had started small, just casual bullying in the hallways, but it had grown into something much darker. There was something about Marcus that infuriated Tyler, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way Marcus never reacted to their taunts, never showed fear, never begged for mercy like the other kids they targeted. That quiet dignity ate at Tyler like acid. Marcus knew they were following him. He could feel their eyes on him as he made his way toward the second-floor bathroom, the one place in the school where he thought he might find a moment of peace before heading to his after-school job at the grocery store. He needed these few minutes of solitude to center himself, to push down the rage that threatened to bubble up every time Tyler and his crew cornered another helpless student. The bathroom door creaked as Marcus pushed it open, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering to life automatically. The small space reeked of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with the lingering odors of a building that had seen decades of teenage life. 4 stalls lined the far wall, their doors covered in graffiti and scratches. A row of sinks with cracked mirrors reflected the unflattering light, and the single window was positioned too high for anyone to see outside. Marcus set his backpack on the counter and splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the stress of another day spent dodging Tyler's attention. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror, seeing his father's dark eyes staring back at him. Carlos Rivera had been a proud man, a skilled martial artist, a loving father who had taught Marcus that true strength came from discipline and control, not from causing pain to others. The bathroom door burst open with a bang that echoed off the tile walls. Tyler Blackwood strutted in with his trademark smirk, his crew filing in behind him like they owned the place. The small space suddenly felt claustrophobic as 4 large teenagers blocked the only exit. Well, Tyler drawled, his voice carrying that particular mix of privilege and cruelty that made Marcus's jaw clench. Look what we have here. The scholarship boy thinks he can hide from us. Devin Walsh giggled like a child, his eyes bright with malicious anticipation. Looks like someone needs a lesson in respect, doesn't he, Tyler? Marcus turned slowly to face them, his expression carefully neutral. He had learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged bullies, but showing defiance could escalate things beyond control. The key was to appear submissive while staying alert for any opportunity to escape. I don't want any trouble, Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Tyler laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the bathroom walls. You don't want trouble? That's cute. But you see, Marcus, you became trouble the day you showed up at our school with your sad little scholarship and your pathetic poverty clothes. Brad Hutchinson had already pulled out his phone, angling it to get the best shot of what was about to happen. This is going to be epic, he whispered to Kyle, who was cracking his knuckles in anticipation. You know what I think? Tyler continued, taking a step closer to Marcus. I think you need to learn your place in the social order. And your place is at the bottom, where trash belongs. Marcus's hands remained at his sides, but his muscles tensed slightly. He could feel the familiar calm settling over him, the mental state his father had taught him to cultivate in moments of danger. Every fiber of his being was calculating distances, analyzing threats, preparing for what might come next. Let's give him a swirly, Devin suggested with obvious glee. Nothing says welcome to the bottom like getting your head dumped in toilet water. Tyler's eyes lit up with sadistic pleasure. Oh, that's perfect. The toilet treatment for the toilet. Boy, Brad, make sure you get this from a good angle. This is going viral. Kyle Morrison stepped forward, his massive hands reaching for Marcus's shoulders. Come on, scholarship boy. Time for your close-up. But as Kyle's fingers made contact with Marcus's shirt, something fundamental shifted. In the small bathroom, the quiet, submissive teenager who had been standing passively by the sinks was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Marcus had been Carlos Rivera's son long before he became Pinewood Valley's target. His father had been more than just a loving parent. He had been a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, a respected instructor at the Iron Wolf dojo, and a man who had dedicated his life to mastering the art of ground fighting. From the time Marcus could walk, Carlos had taught him that martial arts were not about violence or domination, but about protecting yourself and others from those who would cause harm. After Carlos's death from brain cancer 2 years ago, Marcus had made a promise to his father's memory. He would never use his skills to hurt innocent people, never become the kind of person who caused pain for pleasure. He would only fight when he had no other choice, when his safety or the safety of others was at stake. Kyle Morrison's hands on his shoulders crossed that line. The transformation was subtle but complete. Marcus's breathing deepened, his stance shifted almost imperceptibly, and his eyes took on a focus that would have warned anyone familiar with combat sports that they were no longer dealing with a victim. I said I don't want trouble, Marcus repeated, but his voice had changed. There was steel in it now, a quiet confidence that made Tyler's smirk falter for just a moment. Kyle tried to grab Marcus more firmly, intending to drag him toward the nearest stall. What happened next would be replayed in slow motion on social media thousands of times over the next few days. Marcus moved with fluid precision, his body responding to years of training that had been buried but never forgotten. He grabbed Kyle's wrist with both hands, stepped to the side, and used the bigger boy's momentum against him. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, size and strength mattered much less than technique and timing. Kyle found himself flying through the air, his 200-pound frame landing hard on the bathroom floor with a thud that shook the walls. Devin Walsh lunged forward next, apparently thinking he could overwhelm Marcus with sheer aggression. Marcus dropped low, swept Devin's legs out from under him, and watched as the bully crashed into the row of sinks. The impact sent one of the mirrors spiderwebbing across its surface. Tyler Blackwood's face had gone from cruel amusement to shock, to rage in the span of 3 seconds. What the hell? But Marcus wasn't done. Brad Hutchinson was still filming, still recording what he thought would be Marcus's humiliation. Instead, he captured the moment when the quiet scholarship kid revealed himself to be something entirely different. Marcus stepped toward Brad with the controlled movement of a predator, and Brad stumbled backward, his phone clattering to the floor. "Turn off the camera," Marcus said softly. The authority in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a request from a victim. It was a command from someone who had taken complete control of the situation. Tyler was the last one standing, and the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. His 3 friends were on the floor, groaning and trying to figure out how they had ended up there. The kid they had come to humiliate was standing calmly in the center of the bathroom, completely unfazed by their attack. "You're going to pay for this," Tyler snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "My father will have you expelled, arrested, thrown in jail." Marcus looked at him with eyes that held depths Tyler couldn't fathom. "Your father can try. But first, you need to understand something very important." He stepped closer to Tyler, who instinctively backed away until he was pressed against the bathroom wall. "I've been letting you and your friends hurt people because I didn't want to cause trouble," Marcus continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "But what you were planning to do here crossed a line. And now you know what happens when you cross that line." Kyle Morrison was pulling himself to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and pain. Devin Walsh was holding his ribs, trying to determine if anything was broken. Brad Hutchinson was frantically reaching for his phone, which had skittered under one of the stalls. "This isn't over," Tyler said, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Marcus picked up his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "Yes, it is. And Tyler, if I ever see you or your friends targeting another student, if I ever hear about you hurting someone who can't defend themselves, I'll make sure everyone at this school knows exactly what happened in this bathroom today." He walked toward the door, stepping carefully around Kyle, who was still struggling to stand. As he reached for the handle, he turned back one more time. "The camera caught everything, didn't it, Brad? Make sure you keep that video safe. You never know when evidence like that might come in handy." And with that, Marcus Rivera walked out of the second-floor bathroom, leaving 4 bullies to contemplate the fact that their world had just been turned completely upside down. Outside in the hallway, Marcus's calm facade finally began to crack. His hands were shaking slightly as the adrenaline worked its way through his system. He had managed to control himself, to use only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat, but part of him was terrified by how easily the violence had come to him. His father had always warned him that martial arts skills were like a loaded weapon. They could protect innocent people, but they could also destroy lives if used carelessly. As he walked toward the school's exit, Marcus passed other students in the hallway. None of them knew what had just happened in the bathroom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To them, he was still the same quiet scholarship kid who kept to himself and never caused trouble. But Marcus knew that everything had changed. Tyler Blackwood would not let this humiliation stand unchallenged. the relative peace he had maintained at Pinewood Valley High by staying invisible was over. What Marcus didn't know was that his troubles were just beginning. The video Brad had been recording would indeed end up on social media, but not in the way any of them expected. And Tyler Blackwood's father, Richard Blackwood, was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, especially when it involved his son's reputation among Pinewood Valley's elite social circles. The real battle for Marcus Rivera's future was about to begin, and it would test everything his father had taught him about honor, discipline, and the true meaning of strength. As Marcus pushed through the school's front doors and stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, he had no idea that a security camera in the hallway had captured him walking away from the bathroom looking completely unruffled, while 4 other students stumbled out behind him looking like they had been hit by a truck. He didn't know that within hours, that footage would be in the hands of people who had very different ideas about what had really happened in that bathroom. The quiet kid from Pinewood Valley High had revealed his secret, but the consequences of that revelation were going to be far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The Iron Wolf Dojo sat in the heart of Pinewood Valley's industrial district, tucked between a tire shop and an auto parts store in a building that had seen better decades. The converted warehouse had no flashy sign, no welcoming lobby, just a heavy steel door with a small placard that read, "Iron Wolf MS Serious Training Only." Most people drove past without giving it a second glance, which was exactly how Coach Raymond Torres preferred it. Inside, the space told a different story. The concrete floors were covered with thick wrestling mats that had absorbed years of sweat, determination, and sometimes blood. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling beams, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hours of strikes. A cage occupied the center of the room, its chain-link walls bearing witness to sparring sessions that would make professional fighters sweat. The air was thick with the smell of hard work and the dreams of fighters who came here to transform themselves. Marcus Rivera had been coming to Iron Wolf Dojo every evening for the past 2 years, ever since his father's death had forced him to find a new place to train. He couldn't afford the monthly fees that other students paid, but Coach Torres had worked out a different arrangement. Marcus arrived 2 hours before the regular classes began, mopping floors, cleaning equipment, and maintaining the facility in exchange for training time. It was a deal that honored his father's memory while keeping his skills sharp. Tonight felt different as Marcus pushed through the heavy door at exactly 5:30, his usual arrival time. The events in the bathroom 3 hours earlier replayed in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. The way Kyle Morrison had hit the floor, the shock in Tyler Blackwood's eyes, the ease with which techniques he had practiced thousands of times had flowed from muscle memory. He had managed to stay calm during the confrontation, but now the full weight of what had happened was settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Coach Torres looked up from the clipboard he was studying, his weathered face creasing into a frown as he took in Marcus's expression. At 45, Torres was a walking encyclopedia of fighting experience. His nose had been broken so many times it resembled abstract art. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles like roadmaps of old battles, and his left ear was permanently cauliflowered from years of grappling. But his eyes were sharp and kind, the eyes of a man who had seen enough violence to understand its true cost. "You look like someone who just discovered his fists can solve problems," Torres said without preamble. "That's usually the beginning of a very bad story." Marcus grabbed a mop from the utility closet and began his evening routine, but his movements were mechanical, distracted. "I didn't start anything, Coach. They cornered me in the bathroom. 4 against 1. They were going to..." He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Torres set down his clipboard and walked over to where Marcus was working. "Carlos told me you were strong, but he also told me you were smart. Smart enough to know that every time you use what we teach you, there are consequences. So tell me exactly what happened." As Marcus recounted the bathroom incident, Torres listened without interruption. His expression remained neutral, but Marcus could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Torres was evaluating not just what had occurred, but what it meant for Marcus's future. 4 boys, Torres said when Marcus finished. All bigger than you, all with reputations to protect. And you embarrassed them in front of a camera. He shook his head slowly. Your father would be proud of how you handled yourself, but he would also be worried about what comes next. Marcus stopped mopping and looked directly at his mentor. What do you mean? I mean that Tyler Blackwood's father owns half the real estate in this town and has the other half of the city council in his pocket. I mean that rich kids don't just forget when someone makes them look weak. And I mean that you just painted a target on your back that's visible from space. The truth of Torres's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his father's stories about martial arts, the good guys always won and justice always prevailed. But Carlos Rivera had been talking about honorable opponents, not spoiled teenagers with unlimited resources and no moral compass. So what do I do? Marcus asked. Torres picked up a pair of grappling gloves and tossed them to Marcus. You train. You prepare. And you remember that your father didn't teach you those techniques so you could start fights. He taught them to you so you could finish them. The next hour passed in a blur of intense training. Torres pushed Marcus harder than usual, drilling takedowns, submission holds, and escape techniques until sweat poured down his face and his muscles burned with exhaustion. But the physical exertion couldn't quiet the storm of emotions churning in his chest. As they worked through a particularly complex ground fighting sequence, Torres shared stories about Carlos Rivera that Marcus had never heard before. How his father had been one of the most talented grapplers Torres had ever seen. How he had turned down opportunities to fight professionally because he preferred teaching others. How he had always emphasized that true martial artists fought only to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Your father saved my life once, Torres said as they took a water break. Not in some dramatic fight scene, but in a way that mattered more. I was heading down a bad path after my fighting career ended. Drinking too much, making stupid decisions, looking for fights that didn't need to happen. Carlos sat me down and told me that I could either use my skills to hurt people or to help them become better versions of themselves. He offered me a job. Teaching at his old gym gave me a purpose beyond just being angry at the world. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead with a towel. He never told me that story. Carlos didn't talk about his good deeds. He just did them. Torres's expression grew serious. But he did tell me that if anything ever happened to him, I should watch out for his son. Make sure the boy didn't let anger turn him into something he would regret becoming. The words carried weight that made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion. His father had been planning for the possibility of his death, even while fighting the cancer that eventually claimed him. The thought that Carlos Rivera had been worried about his son's future had made arrangements to ensure Marcus wouldn't be alone added another layer of love and loss to grief that was still fresh 2 years later. The techniques you used today were perfect, Torres continued. Minimal force, maximum effect, no permanent damage. But the real test isn't how well you can fight. It's whether you can control yourself when the fighting gets easier than the alternatives. As if summoned by their conversation, the dojo's phone rang. Torres answered with his usual gruff greeting, but his expression quickly shifted to concern. Marcus could only hear one side of the conversation, but the coach's increasingly tense responses told him everything he needed to know. I see, Torres said. And when did this video surface? A pause. No, I understand your position. Yes, he'll be there tomorrow morning. When Torres hung up, his face was grim. That was Principal Webb. Apparently, someone posted video footage of your bathroom encounter on social media. It's been shared over 1,000 times in the past 3 hours. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What does that mean? It means that by tomorrow morning, Everyone in Pinewood Valley will have seen you take down 4 bigger kids without breaking a sweat. Some people will think you're a hero. Others will think you're a dangerous delinquent who doesn't belong in their nice safe school. Torres walked over to a battered laptop computer that he used to show technique videos to his students. After a few minutes of typing and clicking, he turned the screen toward Marcus. The video quality was surprisingly clear, showing the entire bathroom confrontation from Brad Hutchinson's perspective. Marcus watched himself on the screen with a mixture of fascination and horror. The camera had captured everything: Kyle Morrison's aggressive approach, Marcus's lightning-fast response, Devin Walsh's ungraceful collision with the sinks, the moment when Tyler Blackwood realized his crew had just been dismantled by someone they had completely underestimated. What struck Marcus most was how calm he looked throughout the entire encounter. While Tyler and his friends appeared panicked and confused, Marcus moved with the fluid confidence of someone who was completely in control of the situation. To anyone who understood martial arts, it was obvious that he had been holding back, using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threats. "The comments are interesting," Torres said, scrolling through the responses that had accumulated below the video. "About half the people are calling you a hero for standing up to bullies. The other half are saying you're a violent thug who should be expelled or arrested." Marcus reached over Torres's shoulder, his emotions swinging between pride and dread as the comments ranged from supportive to venomous. Some viewers had recognized the techniques he had used, correctly identifying them as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Others speculated about where he had learned to fight, creating elaborate backstories that bore no resemblance to the truth. "Look at this one," Torres said, pointing to a comment that had received dozens of likes. Someone calling themselves Pinewood Parent wrote, "This is exactly what's wrong with bringing scholarship kids into our school. They bring their violent street culture with them and endanger our children. This boy should be expelled immediately before someone gets seriously hurt." The injustice of the comment made Marcus's hands clench into fists. He had been defending himself against 4 attackers who had planned to humiliate him in the most degrading way possible. Yet somehow he was being portrayed as the aggressor. The scholarship student, the outsider, the kid who didn't belong in their pristine suburban world. "And here's another one," Torres continued. "Pinewood Mom says, I don't care what those bullies were planning to do. Violence is never the answer. This boy clearly has anger management issues and needs professional help before he hurts someone." But not all the comments were negative. Defender of Justice had written, "Finally, someone who stands up to these entitled bullies. Every kid who's ever been pushed around is cheering for this guy right now." And Martial Arts Fan had posted, "Those are some serious jiu-jitsu skills. This kid obviously has years of training. He used exactly the right amount of force to stop the attack without causing serious injury. That's the mark of a true martial artist." Torres closed the laptop and looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed concern with something that might have been pride. "Your father always said that the hardest part of being a martial artist isn't learning the techniques. It's learning when to use them and when to walk away. Today you had no choice but to use them. Tomorrow you're going to have to face the consequences." As Marcus finished his cleaning duties and prepared to leave for his evening shift at the grocery store, Torres pulled him aside for one final conversation. "There's something else you need to know," the coach said quietly. "I've been planning to enter you in the Colorado State Grappling Championships next month. It's a legitimate tournament, sanctioned by the State Athletic Commission. Winners get scholarship money and the attention of college recruiters." Marcus's eyes widened. The state championships were a big deal, featuring the best young grapplers from across Colorado. Winners often went on to successful college careers and sometimes even professional fighting contracts. "I've been working with you for 2 years, watching you develop into one of the most naturally talented fighters I've ever coached," Torres continued. "You have your father's technical skill and your own unique style that combines aggression with intelligence. But after what happened today, I need to ask you a serious question. Torres paused, studying Marcus's face carefully. Are you training to become a fighter, or are you training to become a warrior? Because there's a difference, and that difference is going to determine how you handle what comes next. Marcus thought about the question as he walked to his beat-up Honda Civic. In the dojo's parking lot, his father had been a warrior, someone who used his skills to protect and teach others. Carlos Rivera had never needed to prove his toughness or intimidate people to feel good about himself. He had been confident in his abilities without being arrogant, strong without being cruel. But as Marcus drove through Pinewood Valley's quiet streets toward his job at Murphy's Grocery, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to become much more complicated. The video of his bathroom encounter was spreading across social media like wildfire, and every share brought new attention to his previously invisible existence. At Murphy's Grocery, Marcus's supervisor, Mr. Peterson, noticed his distracted state immediately. The older man had been kind to Marcus since he started working there, understanding that the teenager was helping support his mother while maintaining his grades and pursuing his education. "You look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world," Peterson said as Marcus clocked in for his shift. "Everything okay at school?" Marcus considered telling him about the bathroom incident, but decided against it. Mr. Peterson was a good man, but he came from a generation that believed problems could be solved with honest communication and mutual respect. He wouldn't understand the social dynamics that made Tyler Blackwood and his crew untouchable through normal channels. Instead, Marcus threw himself into his work, stocking shelves and helping customers with an intensity that made the evening pass quickly. But every time he glimpsed someone looking at their phone, he wondered if they were watching the video of his confrontation with the bullies. Around 9 o'clock, Sophia Chun walked into the store with her mother. Sophia was one of the few students at Pinewood Valley High who had ever shown Marcus any kindness, occasionally nodding to him in the hallways or including him in group projects when teachers assigned partners randomly. She was brilliant, planning to study computer science at MIT, and had the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was destined for bigger things than high school social politics. When Sophia saw Marcus restocking the cereal aisle, she approached him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I saw the video," she said without preamble. Marcus's hand stilled on the box of cornflakes he was shelving. And I think you're about to discover that being a hero and being popular are two very different things." Sophia glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "My parents are already getting calls from other parents demanding that the school take action against you. They're organizing a petition to have you expelled." The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I was defending myself." The video shows that clearly. The video shows a scholarship student using violence against the sons of some very wealthy and influential families, Sophia corrected gently. Truth and perception aren't always the same thing. As Sophia rejoined her mother at the checkout counter, she turned back to Marcus with a look of sympathy mixed with something that might have been admiration. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I'm glad you finally showed them what you're capable of. Someone needed to stand up to Tyler and his crew. I just hope you're ready for what comes next." After Sophia left, Marcus spent the rest of his shift thinking about her words. He had always assumed that doing the right thing would be enough, that truth would eventually prevail over lies and justice would triumph over corruption. But his father had died fighting a disease that didn't care about fairness, and now Marcus was learning that the adult world was just as capable of injustice as the cancer that had claimed Carlos Rivera's life. When his shift ended at 10 o'clock, Marcus drove home through empty streets, passing the houses of classmates who were probably watching his video and forming opinions about his character based on 30 seconds of carefully edited footage. Tomorrow he would have to face Principal Webb, defend his actions to people who had already made up their minds about his guilt, and somehow continue his education in an environment that was becoming increasingly hostile. But as he pulled into the parking lot of the modest apartment complex where he lived with his mother, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. His father had taught him that a true martial artist never looked for fights, but never backed down from them either. The techniques Carlos Rivera had passed down to his son were not just physical movements, but a philosophy of how to live with honor in a world that often rewarded cowardice and cruelty. Marcus Rivera had revealed his secret, and there was no going back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new tests of his character. But tonight, he would rest in the knowledge that when the moment had come to stand up for himself, he had done so with the skill and restraint his father would have been proud of. The real battle for his future at Pinewood Valley High was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Pinewood Valley High School as Marcus Rivera walked toward the main entrance with measured steps. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing through possible scenarios for the meeting with Principal Webb that awaited him. The school building looked the same as always, red brick and concrete standing solid against the Colorado sky, but everything felt different now. Students arriving for first period turned to stare at him, some with curiosity, others with poorly concealed hostility. Word had spread faster than wildfire through the interconnected social networks that bound Pinewood Valley's teenage population. Together, the video of Marcus's bathroom confrontation had been shared, reshared, commented on, and dissected until it had taken on a life of its own. By morning, nearly every student at the school had seen the 30-second clip that showed their quiet scholarship, classmate dismantling 4 bigger opponents with techniques that looked like something from a martial arts movie. Marcus kept his head up as he walked through the main hallway, refusing to show the anxiety that was churning in his stomach. Groups of students whispered and pointed as he passed, their conversations stopping abruptly when he came within earshot. Some faces showed admiration, others displayed fear, and a significant number reflected the kind of resentment that comes when comfortable social hierarchies are suddenly disrupted. The administrative office was located near the main entrance, behind glass doors that allowed visitors to see the controlled chaos of a high school's nerve center. Secretary Mrs. Hamilton looked up from her computer with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern as Marcus approached her desk. "Marcus Rivera to see Principal Webb," he said quietly. Mrs. Hamilton had worked at Pinewood Valley High for over 20 years, and she had seen enough teenage drama to fill several soap operas. But the situation with Marcus was different. The video footage had created a community-wide controversy that was bringing unwanted attention to the school from parents, school board members, and even local news outlets. "She's waiting for you," Mrs. Hamilton said, her voice carrying a warmth that suggested she was on his side. Room 102, just down the hall. Principal Janet Webb's office was a study in careful neutrality. The walls were covered with motivational posters about education and achievement. Her desk displayed photos of successful graduates, and a small Colorado state flag hung next to her teaching credentials. Webb herself was a woman in her early 50s who had dedicated her career to public education, working her way up from classroom teacher to administrator through 2 decades of budget cuts, policy changes, and the constant pressure of trying to serve students while managing the political realities of running a school. She looked up as Marcus knocked on her open door, her expression carefully controlled. Webb had been dealing with the fallout from the bathroom incident since 6 o'clock that morning, when the first angry parent had called demanding Marcus's immediate expulsion. Her phone had been ringing continuously with calls from school board members, local politicians, and reporters looking for a statement about the violent incident at Pinewood Valley High. "Please sit down, Marcus," Webb said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from her desk. "I imagine you know why you're here." Marcus settled into the chair and met her gaze directly. "I assume it's about what happened in the bathroom yesterday." It's about a video that's been viewed over 50,000 times in the past 18 hours, Webb corrected. A video that shows you using what appears to be professional-level martial arts techniques against 4 of your classmates. She turned her computer monitor so Marcus could see the screen, where the bathroom video was paused at the moment when Kyle Morrison was hitting the floor. The image was crystal clear, showing Marcus in a defensive stance that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. "I've watched this footage dozens of times since last night," Webb continued. "And I have to say, I'm impressed by your restraint. You used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize what was clearly a threatening situation, and you didn't continue the violence once your attackers were down." Marcus felt a surge of relief that was quickly tempered by the principal's next words. However, the community's reaction to this video has been intense. "I've received over 200 calls and emails since yesterday evening, roughly split between people demanding your expulsion and people calling you a hero for standing up to bullies." Webb opened a thick folder on her desk, revealing printed emails, phone message slips, and what appeared to be a formal petition with dozens of signatures. "The Blackwood family has retained a lawyer," she said quietly. "They're claiming that you attacked their son and his friends without provocation, and they're demanding that you be charged with assault and expelled from school immediately." The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. Richard Blackwood's influence in Pinewood Valley was legendary, and his resources were virtually unlimited. If he had decided to make Marcus's life difficult, the teenager was facing a battle he couldn't possibly win. "On the other hand," Webb continued, "I've also received statements from 17 different students who have witnessed Tyler Blackwood and his crew bullying other kids over the past 2 years. Some of these accounts describe behavior that should have resulted in suspensions or expulsions if it had been properly reported at the time." She pulled out another stack of papers, these ones handwritten on notebook paper and school stationery. Marcus could see names he recognized, kids who had been Tyler's victims but had been too scared or too hopeless to come forward until now. "It seems that your video has given a lot of students the courage to speak up about things they've been keeping quiet," Webb said, "including some very serious allegations about cyberbullying, physical intimidation, and what appears to be systematic harassment of scholarship students and other kids who don't fit into Pinewood Valley's social elite." Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and concern. He was glad that other victims were finally getting the chance to tell their stories, but he also knew that every new allegation would make Tyler's family more determined to destroy him in retaliation. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. Webb leaned back in her chair, looking every one of her 53 years. "Now I have to try to navigate between doing what's right for the students and managing the political pressure from some very powerful families. The school board is meeting in emergency session this afternoon to discuss your case." She paused, studying Marcus's face carefully. "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you have formal martial arts training?" "Yes, ma'am. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. My father was an instructor before he died." "How long have you been training?" "About 12 years. Since I was 5. Webb made notes on a legal pad. "Have you ever used your martial arts skills in a fight before yesterday?" "Never. My father taught me that fighting should only be used for self-defense when there's no other option." "And yesterday, did you feel you had any other options?" Marcus thought about the question carefully. They had me cornered in a bathroom, with no way out. There were 4 of them and 1 of me. They were planning to force my head into a toilet bowl while they filmed it for social media. I asked them to leave me alone, but they kept advancing." Webb nodded, making more notes. "The video supports your account. It clearly shows you trying to de-escalate the situation before you were physically grabbed." She closed the folder and looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed sympathy with determination. "Here's what's going to happen. You're suspended from classes pending the school board's decision. but this is not a disciplinary suspension. It's for your own safety, and to give everyone time to cool down." Marcus felt his heart sink. Missing classes would put him behind in his coursework, and he couldn't afford to let his grades slip if he wanted to maintain his scholarship. "I know this isn't fair," Webb continued, "but there are some very angry people out there, and I'm concerned about your safety if you're on campus right now. I've also arranged for you to meet with the school counselor this afternoon to discuss what resources are available to help you through this situation." As Marcus prepared to leave, Webb called him back to her desk. "One more thing," she said, quietly. "Off the record, I want you to know that I've been an educator for 25 years, and I've seen every kind of student there is. You're not a troublemaker, Marcus. You're a good kid who was put in an impossible situation and handled it with more maturity than most adults would have shown." She paused, glancing at the door to make sure they weren't being overheard. "But I also need you to understand that this fight isn't over. The Blackwood family has a lot of influence, and they're not going to let this go quietly. You need to be prepared for things to get worse before they get better." Marcus left the principal's office with his mind reeling from the conversation. As he walked through the hallway toward the exit, he noticed that the normal buzz of student conversation had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Kids who had never paid attention to him before now tracked his movement with their eyes, and he could feel the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure. Near the main entrance, he encountered Sophia Chun waiting by the trophy case. She looked around nervously before approaching him, clearly concerned about being seen talking to the school's most controversial student. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. "I'm suspended pending a school board meeting," Marcus replied. "And apparently the Blackwoods have hired a lawyer." Sophia's expression darkened. "That's not the worst of it. My mom works at the bank where Richard Blackwood is on the board of directors. She heard him talking to some other parents about organizing a campaign to have you not just expelled, but arrested for assault." The information made Marcus's stomach clench with anxiety. Criminal charges would destroy any chance he had of getting into college, and without education, he would be trapped in the same cycle of poverty that had claimed so many other kids from his neighborhood. "There's something else," Sophia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tyler's been telling people that you're dangerous, that you've been trained to kill people, and that no one is safe while you're at the school. He's trying to turn the whole thing into a safety issue." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting emotional would only play into Tyler's narrative that he was unstable and violent. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "I can't prove a negative. I can't prove that I'm not dangerous." "Maybe not," Sophia said, "but you might be able to prove that Tyler and his friends are the real danger. A lot of kids have stories about them, but nobody's ever been brave enough to speak up before. Your video changed something. People are starting to talk." She pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a private group chat that had been created the night before. It was called Pinewood Truth, and it had over 40 members, all students who had been bullied, harassed, or intimidated by Tyler Blackwood and his crew over the past several years. "Look at these messages," Sophia said, scrolling through the chat. Jenny Martinez talking about how Tyler and his friends cornered her in the parking lot and made her give them her lunch money every day for a month. David Kim describing how they destroyed his science project and then laughed when he started crying. Maria Santos explaining how they spread rumors that she was selling drugs just because she's Latina and comes from the poor side of town. Marcus read through the messages with growing amazement. Story after story of cruelty, systematic bullying, and abuse of power that had been going unreported because the victims were too scared or too convinced that nothing would be done to seek help. "Some of these stories are really bad," he said. "Why didn't anyone report this stuff before?" "Because Tyler's dad owns half the town and sits on the school board," Sophia replied. "Because these kids are mostly scholarship students, minorities. Or kids from working-class families who don't have any political influence. Because everyone knows that complaints against the Blackwood family tend to disappear or get turned around on the people making them. She showed him another message thread where students were discussing their fears about coming forward. Several kids mentioned that their parents worked for companies that did business with Richard Blackwood's real estate empire, making them vulnerable to economic retaliation if they spoke out against his son. But your video changed the equation, Sophia explained. Now there's proof that Tyler and his crew are the real aggressors. Now there's evidence that someone can stand up to them and win. These kids are finally ready to tell their stories. As Marcus absorbed this information, he began to understand that his bathroom confrontation had been more than just a personal moment of self-defense. It had been a catalyst that was exposing years of systematic abuse and corruption that had been hidden beneath Pinewood Valley's veneer of suburban respectability. The question is, Sophia continued, what are you going to do with this information? Because if these stories come out officially, it could change everything. But it could also make the Blackwood family even more determined to destroy you in retaliation. Marcus looked at the messages on Sophia's phone, seeing the faces of kids he recognized but had never really talked to. Students who had been suffering in silence while he had been focused on staying invisible and avoiding trouble. His father had always taught him that martial arts weren't just about protecting yourself, but about protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. How do we make sure these stories get heard? He asked. Sophia smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. Leave that to me. I might not be able to throw punches like you, but I know how to organize information and present it in a way that people can't ignore. As Marcus left the school building, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in the span of 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he had been an invisible scholarship student whose biggest worry was avoiding Tyler Blackwood's attention. Now he was suspended from school, facing possible criminal charges, and somehow becoming the focal point of a battle between the powerful and the powerless at Pinewood Valley High. But for the first time since his father's death, Marcus felt like he was part of something bigger than his own survival. The skills Carlos Rivera had taught him weren't just about physical self-defense. They were about having the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. The drive home through Pinewood Valley's quiet streets gave Marcus time to think about what lay ahead. The school board meeting that afternoon would determine whether he had a future at the school. But more importantly, it would set the tone for whether justice could prevail over influence and money. His phone buzzed with a text message from Coach Torres. Heard about the suspension. Come to the dojo early today. We need to talk about your next steps. As Marcus pulled into his apartment complex, he saw his mother Elena waiting for him on their small balcony. She worked the night shift at the hospital, so she should have been sleeping, but the worry on her face told him that she had heard about the situation at school. Elena Rivera was a small woman who had spent the past 2 years carrying burdens that would have crushed someone with less inner strength. Losing her husband to cancer had been devastating enough, but she had also inherited crushing medical debt and the responsibility of raising a teenage son alone while working 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Mio, she called as Marcus climbed the stairs to their apartment. We need to talk. Inside their modest 2-bedroom apartment, Elena had prepared coffee and sandwiches, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders and the worry lines around her eyes that had deepened since Carlos's death. I saw the video, she said without preamble. Mrs. Garcia from downstairs showed it to me on her phone this morning. Marcus braced himself for anger or disappointment, but his mother surprised him. You look just like your father when he was sparring, she said softly. The same calm, the same control, the same way of moving like water around obstacles. She sat down across from him at their small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug for warmth. Your father always worried that teaching you to fight would put you in danger someday, she continued. He said that when you give someone powerful tools, you also give them powerful temptations. Marcus felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I didn't want to fight them, Mama. I tried to walk away. I know, Mio. I can see that in the video. You used exactly what your father taught you. Only as much force as necessary, only when there was no other choice. Alina reached across the table and took her son's hands in hers. But now we have to deal with the consequences. And the consequences of fighting rich people's children are always more serious than the consequences of fighting poor people's children. She had received 3 phone calls that morning from other parents in their apartment complex, all of them worried about the attention Marcus's situation was bringing to their small community. Alina Rivera understood better than her son that their family's survival depended on staying below the radar of people with power and influence. What do you want me to do? Marcus asked. I want you to remember that your father didn't teach you to fight so you could win battles, Alina replied. He taught you to fight so you could choose which battles were worth fighting. As mother and son sat together in their small kitchen, both of them understood that the real battle for Marcus's future was just beginning. The video that had made him famous had also made him a target, and the forces arrayed against him had resources and connections that could destroy his dreams of college and a better life. But Marcus Rivera was his father's son, and Carlos Rivera had never backed down from a fight that mattered. The question now was whether Marcus could find a way to honor his father's memory while navigating the treacherous waters of small town politics and teenage social warfare. The afternoon school board meeting would be the first test of whether truth and justice could prevail against money and influence in Pinewood Valley. And Marcus was about to discover that his real education was just beginning. The Pinewood Valley High School auditorium had never hosted a more contentious gathering. What was supposed to be a routine school board meeting had transformed into a community-wide referendum on privilege, justice, and the very soul of their suburban enclave. By 6 o'clock in the evening, every seat was filled with parents, students, and community members who had come to witness what many were calling the most important decision in the school district's history. Marcus Rivera sat in the front row beside his mother Alina, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes focused on the back of his head. The past 8 hours had been a whirlwind of preparation, consultation, and nervous anticipation. Coach Torres had spent the afternoon drilling Marcus on how to present himself during the hearing, emphasizing the importance of remaining calm and respectful regardless of what accusations were thrown his way. Remember, Torres had said, your father always taught that a true martial artist wins the fight before it begins. Tonight, you win by showing them who you really are. The school board members filed onto the stage, their faces masks of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide the stress of the situation they were about to navigate. Board President Margaret Thornton, a retired teacher with 30 years of experience in education, called the meeting to order with a gravity that acknowledged the significance of the moment. We are here tonight to address the incident that occurred yesterday in the second-floor bathroom of Pinewood Valley High School, Thornton announced, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. This board will hear statements from all parties involved, review the available evidence, and make a determination about the appropriate response. The first speaker was Richard Blackwood, Tyler's father, and his presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Marcus's family spent on groceries in 3 months, Blackwood approached the podium with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way in every situation. Members of the board, fellow parents, concerned citizens, Blackwood began, his voice smooth and authoritative. We are here tonight because a violent criminal has been allowed to infiltrate our school under the guise of academic charity. The harsh word sent a murmur through the audience, and Marcus felt his mother's hand tighten on his arm. Alina Rivera had faced many challenges in her life, but being publicly branded as the mother of a violent criminal was a new kind of humiliation. The video evidence is clear, Blackwood continued, gesturing toward a large screen that had been set up for the presentation. This individual, Marcus Rivera, attacked 4 students without provocation, using what can only be described as professional fighting techniques designed to cause maximum damage. As Blackwood spoke, the bathroom video played on the screen, but Marcus noticed that it had been edited to remove the audio of Tyler's threats and the clear, visual evidence of the aggressive approach by his attackers. The edited version made it appear that Marcus had simply exploded into violence without any justification. My son Tyler and his friends were simply trying to talk to this young man when he unleashed a vicious assault that could have resulted in serious injury or even death, Blackwood declared, his voice rising with manufactured outrage. This is exactly the kind of violence that we moved to Pinewood Valley to escape. The implication was clear and calculated. Marcus wasn't just a troublemaker. He was a representative of the urban violence that affluent families like the Blackwoods had fled to the suburbs to avoid. It was a narrative that would resonate with parents who had made similar choices about where to raise their children. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, our investigation has revealed that Marcus Rivera has been training at an underground fighting gym, learning techniques that are specifically designed for cage fighting and professional mixed martial arts competition. This is not a child defending himself. This is a trained fighter using deadly skills against innocent students. The characterization of the Iron Wolf Dojo as an underground fighting gym was particularly insidious. While technically accurate, it painted a picture of a shadowy, violent organization rather than the legitimate martial arts school that had been serving the community for over a decade. We demand that Marcus Rivera be immediately expelled from Pinewood Valley High School and that criminal charges be filed for assault and battery, Blackwood concluded. Our children deserve to feel safe in their own school, and that safety cannot be guaranteed while this individual remains in our community. The applause that followed Blackwood's speech was scattered but enthusiastic, coming primarily from the section of the auditorium where Tyler's friends and their parents were seated. Marcus could see the satisfaction on their faces, the confidence that comes from having unlimited resources and the expectation that money and influence would prevail over truth and justice. Principal Webb was the next to speak, and her presentation was markedly different in tone and substance. She began by showing the unedited version of the bathroom video, complete with audio that clearly captured Tyler's threats and the aggressive behavior of his crew. What you're seeing here is not an unprovoked attack, Webb explained as the video played. This is a student defending himself against 4 attackers who had cornered him in a bathroom with no means of escape. Note that Marcus Rivera repeatedly asks to be left alone, and that he only acts when he is physically grabbed by Kyle Morrison. Webb then presented a detailed timeline of the incident, supported by testimony from students who had witnessed Tyler's crew planning their bathroom ambush. She also revealed the existence of the Pinewood Truth group chat and the dozens of statements from students who had been victimized by Tyler, Blackwood, and his friends over the past 2 years. The evidence shows a clear pattern of systematic bullying and intimidation, Webb stated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting students. Marcus Rivera was not the aggressor in this situation. He was the latest target of a campaign of harassment that has been going on for years. The mood in the auditorium began to shift as Webb's presentation continued. Parents who had been prepared to demand Marcus's expulsion were now hearing about their own children's experiences with Tyler's crew, stories that had been kept hidden out of fear of retaliation. When Webb finished her presentation, Board President Thornton called for statements from community members. The first speaker was Sophia Chun, who approached the podium with a thick folder of documents and a laptop computer. My name is Sophia Chun, and I'm a senior at Pinewood Valley High School, she began, her voice clear and confident, despite the pressure of addressing such a large and hostile audience. I've spent the past 24 hours documenting the Systematic bullying and harassment that has been occurring at our school for years. Sophia's presentation was masterful in its organization and devastating in its content. She had compiled testimony from 43 students who had been victimized by Tyler's crew, organized the incidents by type and severity, and created a comprehensive timeline that showed the escalation of violence and intimidation over the past 2 years. These are not isolated incidents, Sophia explained as she displayed her data on the auditorium screen. This is a pattern of behavior that has created a climate of fear for any student who doesn't fit into the narrow definition of acceptability defined by Tyler Blackwood and his followers. She presented evidence of cyberbullying campaigns, physical intimidation, destruction of property, and even extortion schemes where students were forced to pay money to avoid being targeted. The documentation was so thorough and well organized that it would have been impressive in a college sociology class, let alone a high school presentation. Marcus Rivera didn't start this conflict, Sophia concluded. He ended it. For the first time in years, someone stood up to Tyler Blackwood and his crew, and suddenly students who had been suffering in silence found the courage to speak their truth. The applause that followed Sophia's presentation was much more sustained and widespread than the response to Blackwood's speech. Parents were beginning to understand that their children had been attending a school where systematic abuse had been occurring under their noses, protected by the influence of wealthy families who saw their children as untouchable. The next speaker was Coach Raymond Torres, who had been reluctant to involve himself in the controversy, but had ultimately decided that he owed it to Carlos Rivera's memory to defend his son. Torres approached the podium with the measured confidence of a man who had faced much tougher audiences in fighting rings around the world. "My name is Raymond Torres, and I'm the owner and head instructor at Iron Wolf Dojo," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never backed down from a challenge. "I knew Marcus Rivera's father, Carlos, and I've been training Marcus for the past 2 years. Torres's presentation focused on the philosophy and discipline of martial arts training, emphasizing that true martial artists are taught to avoid violence whenever possible and to use their skills only when absolutely necessary for self-defense. Marcus Rivera is one of the most disciplined and controlled students I've ever taught," Torres explained. "What you saw in that bathroom video was not a violent assault. It was a textbook example of how to neutralize multiple attackers, using the minimum force necessary to ensure personal safety." He then showed a series of training videos that demonstrated the techniques Marcus had used, explaining how each movement was designed to subdue rather than injure, to control rather than destroy. If Marcus had wanted to hurt those boys, he could have hospitalized all 4 of them within seconds, Torres stated matter-of-factly. Instead, he used precise, controlled techniques that stopped the attack without causing any serious injury. That's the mark of a true martial artist. Torres's presentation was followed by statements from several other students who had been inspired by Marcus's example to speak out about their own experiences with bullying. Jenny Martinez, a shy sophomore who had been one of Tyler's frequent targets, stood at the podium with tears in her eyes as she described months of intimidation and harassment that had made her dread coming to school every day. "Marcus Rivera gave me hope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. "He showed me that bullies aren't invincible, that someone can stand up to them and win. For the first time in 2 years, I feel safe at school." David Kim, a junior who had been targeted because of his Korean heritage, spoke about the systematic racism that Tyler's crew had directed at minority students. His parents, who had immigrated to America to give their children better opportunities, sat in the audience with expressions of heartbreak and determination. "Tyler Blackwood called me a gook and told me to go back to my own country," David stated, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He said that scholarship students like Marcus and kids like me were ruining the school for real Americans. Marcus Rivera is more American than Tyler Blackwood will ever be, because he stood up for what's right instead of what's easy. The parade of student testimonies continued for over an hour, each story adding another layer to the picture of systematic abuse that had been hidden beneath Pinewood Valley High School's reputation for academic excellence. Parents who had been prepared to demand Marcus's expulsion were now learning that their own children had been attending a school where cruelty and prejudice were protected by wealth and influence. When the student testimonies concluded, Board President Thornton called for Marcus Rivera to address the assembly. The walk from his seat to the podium felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life, but he drew strength from the memory of his father's teachings about courage and honor. "My name is Marcus Rivera," he began, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure of the moment. "2 days ago, I was just trying to get through high school quietly so I could graduate and go to college. I never wanted to hurt anyone, and I never wanted to be in this situation." Marcus spoke about his father's death, about the financial struggles that had forced his family to relocate, about the scholarship that represented his only chance at a better future. He talked about the philosophy of martial arts that Carlos Rivera had taught him, emphasizing that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. "When Tyler Blackwood and his friends cornered me in that bathroom, I had 2 choices," Marcus explained. "I could let them humiliate me and hope that would be enough to satisfy them, or I could defend myself and accept whatever consequences came from that decision." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces that included both supporters and detractors. "I chose to defend myself, but I also chose to do it in a way that honored my father's teachings. I used only the techniques necessary to stop the attack, and I made sure not to cause any permanent harm. That's what real martial arts training teaches you, how to be strong enough to protect yourself without becoming the kind of person who hurts others for pleasure." Marcus's speech was followed by the most sustained applause of the evening, and he could see that many of the parents who had entered the auditorium prepared to demand his expulsion were now reconsidering their positions. The final speaker was Elena Rivera, Marcus's mother, who had been reluctant to address such a large crowd, but had ultimately decided that her son's future was worth overcoming her fear of public speaking. "I am Elena Rivera, and Marcus is my son," she began in accented English, her voice carrying the dignity of someone who had faced much greater challenges than a hostile school board meeting. "My husband Carlos died 2 years ago, and before he died, he made me promise that I would make sure our son grew up to be a good man." Elena spoke about her husband's dedication to martial arts as a way of building character rather than simply learning to fight. She talked about the financial struggles that had forced them to accept charity and scholarships, and about the determination that had kept Marcus focused on his education despite the obstacles he faced. "My son is not violent," she concluded, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He is strong. There is a difference, and that difference is what my husband spent 15 years teaching him." When the public comment period ended, the school board members retired to deliberate. The wait was excruciating, with hundreds of people sitting in tense silence as the future of Marcus Rivera's education hung in the balance. After 45 minutes, the board members returned to their seats. Board President Thornton stood to deliver their decision, and the auditorium fell completely silent. After reviewing the evidence and considering the testimony presented tonight, this board finds that Marcus Rivera acted in self-defense against an unprovoked attack by 4 students who had cornered him in a bathroom with no means of escape, Thornton announced. The relief that washed over Marcus was almost overwhelming, but Thornton wasn't finished. Furthermore, this board finds that there has been a systematic failure to address bullying and intimidation at Pinewood Valley High School, particularly involving students from wealthy families who believed their social status made them immune to consequences. She paused, her eyes moving across the auditorium to where Tyler Blackwood and his parents were seated. "Effective immediately, Tyler Blackwood is expelled from Pinewood Valley high school for his role in orchestrating the campaign of harassment and intimidation against multiple students. Kyle Morrison, Devin Walsh, and Brad Hutchinson are suspended for the remainder of the academic year. The auditorium erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouting. Richard Blackwood was on his feet, his face red with rage as he pointed an accusing finger at the board members. "This is a travesty of justice," he shouted. "You're destroying the future of good students to protect a violent criminal." But his protests were drowned out by the applause of parents and students, who had finally seen accountability applied equally regardless of wealth and social status. Marcus Rivera is reinstated to full academic standing effective immediately, Thornton continued when the noise died down. Furthermore, this board apologizes to him and his family for the failure of our institution to protect him from the harassment he endured. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, Marcus found himself surrounded by students and parents who wanted to thank him for having the courage to stand up to Tyler's crew. But the person whose approval mattered most was Coach Torres, who approached with a proud smile and a firm handshake. "Your father would be proud," Torres said simply. "You fought the right fight in the right way." 3 weeks later, Marcus Rivera stepped onto the mat at the Colorado State Grappling Championships with a confidence that came from knowing he had already won the most important battle of his life. The tournament was being held at the Pinewood Community Center, and the stands were filled with classmates and teachers who had come to support the young man who had become a symbol of courage for their entire community. His first opponent was a highly ranked wrestler from Denver who had been training for years to win the state championship. But as they circled each other on the mat, Marcus felt the calm focus that his father had taught him to cultivate in moments of challenge. The match was a showcase of technical skill and mental toughness that had the crowd on their feet. Marcus's opponent was strong and experienced, but Marcus had something more, the knowledge that he was fighting not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever been bullied, every student who had ever felt powerless, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. When the referee raised Marcus's hand in victory, the cheers from the Pinewood Valley section were deafening. Sophia Chun was jumping up and down in the stands, Coach Torres was beaming with pride, and Elena Rivera was crying tears of joy as she watched her son accept the gold medal that represented not just athletic achievement, but triumph over adversity. As Marcus stood on the podium with the Colorado State Championship medal around his neck, he looked out at the crowd and saw Tyler Blackwood sitting in the back row. The former bully was alone, his crew having abandoned him when his family's influence could no longer protect them from the consequences of their actions. For a moment, their eyes met across the gymnasium. Marcus saw anger and resentment in Tyler's expression, but also something that might have been respect. The quiet kid who had once been his favorite target had become someone who could no longer be intimidated or dismissed. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by college recruiters who had been impressed by his performance in the tournament. Scholarship offers from major universities were on the table, opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. But the most meaningful moment came when a group of younger students from Pinewood Valley High approached him with shy smiles and autograph requests. These were kids who had been suffering in silence, just as Marcus had done, but who now had hope that they could stand up for themselves and others. "You showed us that bullies aren't invincible," said a freshman named Danny, who had been one of Tyler's newest targets. "You showed us that doing the right thing is worth fighting for." As Marcus signed the boys' tournament program, he felt the presence of his father's spirit and knew that Carlos Rivera's teachings had found their ultimate expression. The martial arts techniques that had started as a way to build character in a young boy had evolved into something much more powerful, a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt powerless. 6 months later, Marcus Rivera graduated valedictorian of his class at Pinewood Valley High School. His acceptance speech focused on the importance of using whatever talents and abilities you possess to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He spoke about his father's teachings, about the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, and about the difference between being strong and being violent. Tyler Blackwood was not in the audience. He had been sent to a private military academy in another state, where his parents hoped that discipline and structure would help him develop the character that money and privilege had failed to instill. But Tyler's absence didn't diminish the impact of Marcus's journey. His story had become legend at Pinewood Valley High School, inspiring a new generation of students to believe that justice could prevail over influence, that courage could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the quiet kid in the back of the class might just be the hero everyone was waiting for. As Marcus Rivera walked across the graduation stage to accept his diploma, he carried with him the knowledge that he had honored his father's memory in the most meaningful way possible, by using his strength to protect others, and his courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The boy who had once scrubbed floors at a martial arts gym in exchange for training had become a man who understood that true power comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the willingness to defend those who cannot defend themselves. And in a world that often rewards the loudest voice and the biggest fist, Marcus Rivera had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a quiet conscience and the courage to use it. 2 years had passed since the bathroom confrontation that changed everything at Pinewood Valley High School, and Marcus Rivera found himself standing in the doorway of his old computer lab, watching a scene that would have been impossible during his own high school years. A group of freshmen were working together on a coding project, their conversation animated and free from the undercurrent of fear that had once permeated every corner of the school. Among them was Danny Morales, the shy freshman who had approached Marcus for an autograph at the state championship. Now a confident junior, Danny had become the president of the newly formed Student Advocacy Council, an organization that ensured no student would ever again suffer in silence the way so many had during Tyler Blackwood's reign of terror. "Mr. Rivera," Danny called out, his face lighting up as he spotted his former hero in the doorway. "Are you here for the assembly?" Marcus smiled, adjusting the visitor's badge that Principal Webb had insisted he wear despite his familiarity with the building. At 19, he had grown into his frame, his shoulders broader and his presence more commanding than the invisible teenager who had once walked these same hallways. The confidence that came from surviving real battles showed in his posture and his steady gaze. "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. "How's the anti-bullying program working out?" Danny's enthusiasm was infectious as he launched into a detailed explanation of the peer mediation system that had been implemented school-wide. Students were trained to recognize the early signs of bullying and harassment. Intervention protocols had been established, and most importantly, there were multiple channels for reporting incidents that couldn't be buried by influential parents or swept under the rug by administrators more concerned with reputation than justice. "We've had 0 serious incidents this year," Danny reported proudly. "A few minor conflicts, but nothing like what used to happen. Kids actually want to come to school now." As Marcus made his way through the hallways toward the auditorium, he was struck by the transformation that had taken place at Pinewood Valley High. The atmosphere felt lighter, more inclusive, with students from different social and economic backgrounds interacting naturally instead of maintaining the rigid caste system that had once defined the school's social structure. The walls were lined with new posters promoting respect, diversity, and academic achievement over social status. A display case near the main entrance showcased not just athletic trophies and academic awards, but also recognition for community service, peer mentoring, and acts of courage in standing up for others. Principal Webb intercepted Marcus near the auditorium entrance, her face beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had seen her life's work vindicated. The past 2 years had been the most rewarding of her educational career, as she had been able to implement the kind of comprehensive anti-bullying policies that had previously been blocked by political pressure from wealthy families. "Marcus, thank you so much for coming back," she said, shaking his hand warmly. "The students are incredibly excited to hear your story." Webb had invited Marcus to speak at the school's annual Character and Courage Assembly, an event that had been created in the aftermath of the Tyler Blackwood incident to celebrate students who demonstrated moral leadership and personal integrity. It had become one of the most anticipated events of the school year, drawing not just students and faculty, but also parents and community members who wanted to reinforce the values that now defined Pinewood Valley High School. "How's college treating you?" Webb asked as they walked toward the auditorium. Marcus's smile carried the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. After graduating as valedictorian, he had accepted a full scholarship to Colorado State University, where he was pursuing a double major in engineering and education. His academic performance had been exceptional, but it was his work with the university's peer counseling program that had really made him stand out among his classmates. "It's been incredible," Marcus replied. "I'm actually thinking about graduate school after I finish my bachelor's degree. Maybe become a teacher myself someday." The idea of Marcus Rivera returning to education as a profession would have seemed impossible during his days as a silent target of systematic bullying. But his experiences at Pinewood Valley High had given him a unique perspective on the challenges facing young people, and he had discovered a passion for helping others navigate the complexities of adolescence and academic pressure. As they entered the auditorium, Marcus was struck by how different the space felt from that contentious evening when his future had been decided by a school board meeting. Today, the atmosphere was celebratory, with students chatting excitedly and teachers moving through the aisles with the relaxed confidence of educators who truly enjoyed their work environment. The audience included several faces that Marcus recognized from his high school years, including Sophia Chun, who had graduated summa cum laude from MIT and was now working as a software engineer for a major tech company. She had driven down from Denver specifically to hear Marcus speak, and her presence in the audience reminded him of how important it had been to have all eyes during his darkest moments. Coach Torres was also in attendance, sitting in the section reserved for community members. At 47, he looked healthier and more content than Marcus had ever seen him. The Iron Wolf Dojo had experienced a surge in enrollment following the publicity around Marcus's story, but more importantly, Torres had been able to establish partnerships with local schools to provide martial arts education as part of their physical education and character development programs. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty," Principal Webb announced from the podium, "please welcome back to Pinewood Valley High School someone who embodies everything we hope to instill in our students: courage, integrity, perseverance, and the strength to stand up for what's right. Please join me in welcoming Marcus Rivera." The applause that greeted Marcus as he walked to the podium was thunderous and sustained, but it wasn't the polite recognition typically given to guest speakers. This was the kind of ovation reserved for heroes, for people who had risked everything to make life better for others. Many of the students in the audience had never experienced the kind of systematic bullying that had once been commonplace at their school, but they understood that their safer, more inclusive environment existed because one quiet teenager had found the courage to fight back. Marcus took a moment to look out at the sea of young faces, remembering his own high school experience, and marveling at how different these students' lives were from his own had been. They carried themselves with a confidence that came from knowing they were valued and protected, that their voices would be heard if they needed help, and that their school was a place where character mattered more than social status or family wealth. "Thank you for that warm welcome," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without the need for amplification. "It's incredible to be back here, in a place that holds so many memories for me, both difficult and transformative." He spoke about his early years at Pinewood Valley High, the isolation and fear that had defined his daily experience, and the systematic harassment that had been allowed to flourish because the perpetrators came from influential families. But he was careful to frame these experiences not as complaints or attempts to relitigate old grievances, but as context for understanding how much the school had changed. When I was a student here, I spent most of my time trying to be invisible. Marcus continued. I thought that if I could just keep my head down and avoid attracting attention, I could survive until graduation and escape to college. What I didn't understand then was that survival isn't the same as living, and that sometimes you have to risk everything to protect not just yourself, but others who can't protect themselves. He talked about his father's death and the financial struggles that had brought his family to Pinewood Valley as scholarship recipients. He described the martial arts training that had given him the skills to defend himself, but more importantly, the philosophy that had taught him when and how to use those skills. My father used to tell me that martial arts weren't about learning to fight, Marcus explained. They were about learning to live with honor, to protect those who needed protection, and to find strength in discipline rather than aggression. When I was cornered in that bathroom 2 years ago, I wasn't thinking about winning or losing. I was thinking about the lessons my father had taught me and the kind of person I wanted to be. The auditorium was completely silent as Marcus recounted the bathroom confrontation, but his telling of the story was different from the dramatic versions that had circulated on social media. He focused not on the physical techniques he had used, but on the split-second decisions that had determined how he would respond to the attack. I had a choice in that moment, he said. I could let fear and anger control my actions, or I could respond with the discipline and restraint that my father had spent years teaching me. I chose to use only the minimum force necessary to protect myself, and I made sure that none of my attackers were seriously injured, even though they had shown no such consideration for my safety. Marcus then shifted his focus to the aftermath of the incident, the community response, and the systematic changes that had been implemented at Pinewood Valley High School. He praised the courage of students like Sophia Chun, who had organized the evidence that exposed the pattern of bullying, and he acknowledged the leadership of administrators like Principal Webb, who had fought to implement meaningful reforms. The real heroes of this story aren't the people who threw punches or made dramatic gestures, Marcus explained. They're the people who did the hard work of changing systems, gathering evidence, and creating new policies that would protect future students from experiencing what I and so many others had endured. He spoke about the importance of bystander intervention, the responsibility that everyone shares to speak up when they witness injustice, and the ways that seemingly small acts of courage can create ripple effects that transform entire communities. Every single person in this auditorium has the power to make a difference, Marcus declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through real challenges and emerged stronger. You don't need to know martial arts to stand up to bullies. You don't need to be physically strong to protect others. You just need to be willing to do what's right, even when it's difficult or scary. As Marcus concluded his formal remarks, he opened the floor for questions from the audience. The first came from a sophomore who wanted to know how Marcus had found the courage to fight back after so many months of accepting harassment. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Marcus replied. It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. I was terrified that day in the bathroom, but I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't stand up for myself. Sometimes the scariest choice is also the right choice. A junior asked about Marcus's martial arts training and whether other students should learn self-defense techniques. Marcus's response was thoughtful and nuanced, emphasizing that physical skills were less important than mental discipline and moral character. Learning martial arts taught me discipline, respect, and self-control, he explained. Those are valuable lessons for anyone. But the most important thing my training gave me wasn't the ability to defend myself physically. It was the confidence to believe that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Sophia Chun raised her hand from the audience, and Marcus smiled as he recognized his former classmate and ally. What advice would you give to students who see bullying happening but aren't sure how to intervene safely? She asked. Marcus's response drew on his college experiences working with peer counseling programs and conflict resolution initiatives. You don't always have to confront bullies directly, he explained. Sometimes the most effective intervention is reporting the behavior to trusted adults, supporting the victims, or simply refusing to be an audience for cruelty. Bullies thrive on attention and the silence of bystanders. When you remove those elements, their power disappears. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics ranging from dealing with social media harassment to building inclusive communities to finding the strength to forgive people who have caused harm. Marcus's responses demonstrated the wisdom that comes from real-world experience, combined with continued education and personal growth. As the assembly concluded, Marcus was surrounded by students who wanted to thank him for his courage or share their own stories of overcoming challenges. Many of them had never experienced the kind of systematic bullying that had once been commonplace at Pinewood Valley High, but they understood that their safer environment existed because someone had been willing to fight for it. One conversation particularly touched Marcus's heart. A shy freshman named Amanda approached him with tears in her eyes, explaining that she had been struggling with anxiety and depression related to social pressures at school. "Your story gives me hope that things can get better," she said quietly. "It helps me believe that I'm stronger than I sometimes feel." Marcus spent several minutes talking with Amanda about resources available at the school, including counseling services and peer support groups that hadn't existed during his own high school years. He also gave her his email address and encouraged her to reach out if she ever needed someone to talk to who understood what it felt like to feel isolated and overwhelmed. After the assembly, Marcus joined Principal Webb, Coach Torres, and Sophia Chun for lunch at a local restaurant that had become a popular gathering place for Pinewood Valley High School alumni. The conversation ranged from updates on their current lives to reflections on how much their community had changed in the past 2 years. "You know what's really remarkable?" Sophia observed as they discussed the school's transformation. "It's not just that bullying has decreased. The whole academic culture has improved. Kids are more collaborative, more supportive of each other's success. When you remove the fear and competition that comes from systematic harassment, everyone performs better." Coach Torres nodded in agreement, sharing statistics about increased participation in extracurricular activities and improved graduation rates among students from lower-income families. Marcus's story did more than stop one group of bullies. Torres explained. It changed the entire conversation about what kind of community Pinewood Valley wanted to be. Kids who might have become bullies themselves saw what happened to Tyler and his crew and decided to make different choices. The mention of Tyler Blackwood brought a moment of quiet reflection to the conversation. Marcus had heard through various channels that Tyler had eventually graduated from the military academy his parents had sent him to, and that he was now attending a small college in another state. There were reports that he had apologized to some of his former victims and was involved in anti-bullying initiatives at his new school, though Marcus had never received a direct apology himself. "Do you ever think about Tyler?" Sophia asked. "Do you think people can really change, or was what happened to him just about consequences catching up with him?" Marcus considered the question carefully. His experiences in college, particularly his work with peer counseling and conflict resolution, had given him new perspectives on human behavior and the possibility of redemption. "I think Tyler was a product of a system that taught him that wealth and status made him untouchable," Marcus replied. "When that system failed him, he had to confront who he really was underneath all the privilege and entitlement. I hope he learned something from that experience, but ultimately, that's his journey to make." He paused, looking out the restaurant. window at the streets of Pinewood Valley, where he had once felt so isolated and unwelcome. What I've learned is that my healing and growth can't depend on whether the people who hurt me eventually apologize or change their behavior. Marcus continued. I had to find a way to move forward regardless of what Tyler or anyone else decided to do with their lives. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory his life had taken since that pivotal day in the school bathroom. He had never intended to become a symbol or a spokesperson for anti-bullying efforts, but his story had resonated with people far beyond Pinewood Valley High School. He received regular emails from students around the country who had heard his story and found inspiration in it. Some were dealing with their own bullying situations. Others were working to create more inclusive environments at their schools. And many were simply young people trying to find the courage to stand up for their values in challenging circumstances. Marcus had also been invited to speak at conferences, workshops, and other schools about his experiences. While he was selective about these opportunities, wanting to focus primarily on his education, he had found deep satisfaction in sharing his story with audiences who could benefit from hearing it. The most meaningful aspect of his advocacy work was the connections he had made with other young people who had faced similar challenges. Through social media and speaking engagements, Marcus had become part of a network of individuals who were working to create more compassionate and inclusive communities. As the lunch gathering concluded and Marcus prepared to drive back to Colorado State University for his evening classes, Coach Torres pulled him aside for a private conversation. Your father would be incredibly proud of the man you've become, Torres said, his voice carrying the emotion of someone who had watched Marcus grow from a grieving teenager into a confident young adult. Carlos always believed that the measure of a martial artist wasn't how many fights they won, but how many fights they prevented through their presence and character. The words brought tears to Marcus's eyes, as memories of his father always did. Carlos Rivera had been gone for over 4 years now, but his influence on Marcus's life remained as strong as ever. The values he had instilled, the techniques he had taught, and the example he had set continued to guide Marcus's decisions and shape his character. I still think about him every day, Marcus replied, especially when I'm facing difficult decisions or challenging situations. I ask myself what he would do, what advice he would give, how he would want me to represent the Rivera family name. Torres smiled, remembering his friend and training partner, who had died too young but had left behind a legacy that would continue through his son's actions and character. Carlos lives on through you, Torres said simply. Every time you choose courage over fear, discipline over impulse, service of interest, you honor his memory in the most meaningful way possible. As Marcus drove back to college that evening, he thought about the students he had met at the assembly and the conversations he had shared with his former classmates and mentors. Pinewood Valley High School had become a different place, a better place, because people had been willing to confront uncomfortable truths and make difficult changes. But Marcus also understood that the work was never really finished. Each new class of students brought fresh challenges, and maintaining a culture of respect and inclusion required constant vigilance and commitment from everyone in the community. His own journey was far from over as well. Marcus had dreams of becoming a teacher himself someday, of working with young people who were facing their own versions of the challenges he had overcome. He wanted to create environments where every student felt valued and protected, where learning could flourish without the shadow of fear and intimidation. The martial arts training that had once been his secret weapon had evolved into something even more powerful, a commitment to using his strength, his voice, and his story to make the world a little bit safer and more just for the next generation. As Marcus pulled into the parking lot of his dormitory, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that day when 4 bullies had cornered him in a high school bathroom. What they had intended as his ultimate humiliation had become the catalyst for his transformation from victim to advocate, From invisible teenager to inspiring young leader, the quiet kid from Pinewood Valley High School had found his voice, and he was using it to ensure that no other student would have to suffer in silence the way he once had. In a world that often rewards the loudest and most aggressive voices, Marcus Rivera had proven that sometimes the most powerful strength comes from those who choose to protect rather than dominate, to heal rather than harm, to build bridges rather than tear them down. His father's lessons lived on, not just in the martial arts techniques that had kept Marcus safe in a moment of crisis, but in the values that continued to guide his choices every single day. Carlos Rivera had taught his son to be a warrior in the truest sense, someone who fights not for personal glory or revenge, but for justice, protection, and the creation of a better world for others. And as Marcus Rivera walked into his dormitory, backpack slung over his shoulder and confidence evident in every step, he carried with him the knowledge that his greatest battle still lay ahead, not in bathrooms or gymnasiums, but in classrooms and communities where the next generation would learn what it truly means to stand up for what's right. 5 years after the incident that transformed Pinewood Valley High School forever, Marcus Rivera stood before a packed auditorium at the PAS National Education Conference in Denver, addressing an audience of teachers, administrators, and counselors from across the United States. At 24, he had completed his master's degree in educational psychology and was now working as a high school counselor while pursuing his doctorate in conflict resolution. The conference had invited Marcus to deliver the keynote speech on building resilient school communities, recognizing him as one of the leading voices in anti-bullying advocacy and restorative justice in education. His research on peer mediation and inclusive school cultures had been published in several academic journals, but it was his personal story and practical insights that made him such a compelling speaker. When we talk about school safety, we often focus on external threats and physical security measures. Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through both sides of the equation. But the greatest threats to our students' well-being often come from within our own hallways, from the social dynamics we allow to flourish unchallenged, from the systems that protect some students while leaving others vulnerable. The audience was completely engaged as Marcus shared data from his research, showing correlations between inclusive school policies and improved academic outcomes, decreased dropout rates, and enhanced mental health indicators among students. But the statistics were given context through his personal experiences and the stories of countless other students he had worked with over the years. Marcus had spent the past 3 years working at Jefferson High School in Aurora, Colorado, a diverse urban school that served students from a wide range of economic and cultural backgrounds. The position had been both challenging and rewarding, allowing him to put into practice the theories he had studied while completing his graduate work. His office at Jefferson High had become a sanctuary for students dealing with everything from academic pressure to family crises to social conflicts. Marcus's unique background, combining personal experience with systematic oppression and professional training in counseling techniques, made him particularly effective at connecting with young people who felt marginalized or misunderstood. One of the most important lessons I've learned, Marcus continued his keynote address, is that every bully was once a victim, and every victim has the potential to become either a bully or a healer. The choice they make depends largely on the support systems and interventions we provide during their most vulnerable moments. The statement reflected years of professional experience and personal reflection. Marcus had worked with students who reminded him of Tyler Blackwood, young people whose aggressive behavior masked deep insecurities and unresolved trauma. He had also counseled victims of bullying who were struggling with anger and thoughts of retaliation, helping them find healthier ways to process their experiences and reclaim their power. One case that had particularly impacted Marcus involved a sophomore named Miguel Santos, whose situation eerily paralleled Marcus's own high school experience. Miguel was a scholarship student from a low-income family who was being systematically harassed by a group of wealthier classmates. The bullying had escalated from verbal taunts to physical intimidation, and Miguel was beginning to show signs of depression and academic decline. When Miguel was referred to Marcus's office, the parallels to his own story were immediately apparent. The same social dynamics, the same economic disparities, the same feeling of powerlessness in the face of systematic cruelty. But Marcus was now in a position to provide the kind of intervention and support that hadn't existed during his own high school years. Working with Miguel had required a multifaceted approach that addressed not just the immediate bullying situation, but also the underlying systemic issues that allowed such behavior to flourish. Marcus had documented the harassment, built a coalition of supportive teachers and administrators, and worked directly with the perpetrators to understand the motivations behind their behavior. The process had taken months, but the outcome had been transformative for everyone involved. Miguel not only survived the bullying but thrived academically and socially, eventually becoming a peer mediator himself. The students who had been harassing him were required to participate in restorative justice circles that helped them understand the impact of their actions and develop more positive ways of dealing with their own insecurities. The traditional approach to bullying often focuses on punishment and separation, Marcus explained to the conference audience. But what I've learned is that healing happens through connection and understanding. When we create opportunities for honest dialogue between victims and perpetrators, when we address the root causes of aggressive behavior rather than just the symptoms, we can break cycles of violence that might otherwise continue for generations. As Marcus concluded his keynote speech, he received a standing ovation from the hundreds of educators in attendance. But the most meaningful moment came during the question and answer session that followed, when a teacher from rural Montana asked how to apply these principles in communities where resources were limited and resistance to change was strong. Marcus's response drew on his work with schools across Colorado, where he had served as a consultant helping districts develop anti-bullying policies and implement restorative justice programs. He understood that not every community had the resources or political will to make dramatic changes, but he had learned that even small interventions could have significant impacts. Change doesn't always happen all at once, he replied. Sometimes it starts with one teacher who decides to handle conflicts differently, one administrator who chooses to really listen to students' concerns, one parent who models empathy and respect in their interactions with others. The key is to start somewhere and to be persistent in your commitment to creating a better environment for all students. After the conference concluded, Marcus was approached by several publishers who were interested in working with him on a book about his experiences and his professional insights into bullying prevention. The idea of writing a book had been suggested to him many times over the years, but he had always felt that his story was still unfolding, that he needed more experience and perspective before attempting to capture it in print. Now, however, Marcus felt ready to take on the project. His academic training had given him the analytical tools to understand his experiences in a broader context, and his work as a counselor had provided him with hundreds of additional stories that illustrated the principles he wanted to share. The book, which he tentatively titled The Quiet Warrior, Finding Strength in Adversity and Building Bridges Through Understanding, would combine memoir, research, and practical guidance for educators, parents, and young people dealing with bullying and social conflict. As Marcus flew back to Denver that evening, he reflected on how far he had traveled from the scared teenager who had once spent his lunch periods hiding in computer labs. His journey had taken him through moments of despair and triumph, through academic achievements and personal growth, through professional success and continued service to others. The airplane descended through the clouds over the Colorado landscape, and Marcus could see the lights of communities spread out below him. Each of those lights represented families, schools, and young people who were dealing with their own versions of the challenges he had faced. Some were struggling in silence, some were fighting back against injustice, and some were working to create more compassionate communities. Marcus had received thousands of emails over the years from students, teachers, and parents who had been touched by his story. Many shared their own experiences with bullying and social conflict, seeking advice or simply wanting to connect with someone who understood their struggles. Others had been inspired to take action in their own communities, implementing programs or policies that created safer environments for vulnerable students. One message that had particularly moved Marcus came from a teacher in Oregon who had been working with a student named Sarah, a quiet girl who was being systematically excluded and harassed by her classmates. The teacher had shared Marcus's story with Sarah, and it had given her the courage to speak up about her experiences and seek help from trusted adults. Sarah had not only survived her bullying situation, but had gone on to become a peer counselor at her school, helping other students navigate social conflicts and find their voices. Her story was just one of many that demonstrated the ripple effects of courage and compassion, showing how one person's decision to stand up for what's right could inspire others to do the same. As Marcus drove home from the airport, he passed the exit for Pinewood Valley and felt a familiar mixture of emotions. The community that had once felt so hostile and unwelcoming had become a symbol of hope and transformation for him. The changes that had been implemented at the high school had been sustained and expanded over the years, creating a model that other districts were now studying and replicating. Principal Webb had retired the previous year, but not before seeing graduation rates reach all-time highs and bullying incidents drop to near zero. The Student Advocacy Council that Danny Morales had helped establish was now a permanent part of the school's governance structure, giving students a real voice in policies that affected their daily lives. Sophia Chun had returned to Pinewood Valley the previous month for her 5-year reunion, and she had sent Marcus photos from the event. The reunion had been notably different from typical high school gatherings, with former students gathering not just to reminisce about the past, but to celebrate the positive changes that had been made since their graduation. Even Tyler Blackwood had attended the reunion, though he had kept a low profile and left early. Sophia had reported that he looked older and more subdued than she remembered, and that he had spent most of the evening in quiet conversations with former classmates rather than holding court the way he once had. Several people had mentioned to Sophia that Tyler had approached them individually to apologize for his behavior during high school. The apologies were apparently genuine and specific, showing that he had given serious thought to the impact of his actions on others. While some people remained skeptical of his transformation, others had been moved by his obvious remorse and his efforts to make amends. Marcus had mixed feelings about these reports. Part of him was genuinely glad to hear that Tyler had apparently learned from his experiences and was working to become a better person. But another part of him remained cautious, remembering the pain and fear that Tyler's actions had caused not just for him, but for dozens of other students. More importantly, Marcus had learned that his own healing and growth couldn't depend on whether Tyler or anyone else ever apologized or changed their behavior. The work of building resilient communities and supporting vulnerable young people had to continue regardless of what individual perpetrators decided to do with their lives. The following week, Marcus received a call that would change the trajectory of his career once again. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Southern California, was inviting him to join their faculty as an assistant professor specializing in school psychology and conflict resolution. The position would allow Marcus to conduct research, teach graduate students, and continue his work developing evidence-based interventions for bullying and social conflict. It was an opportunity to influence educational policy at a national level and to train the next generation of school counselors and administrators. Marcus accepted the position, but not before ensuring that his current students at Jefferson High School would have continued support during his transition. He had been working with several young people who reminded him of his younger self, students who were dealing with family trauma, economic hardship, and social marginalization. One of these students was Alex Chen, Sophia's younger cousin, who had transferred to Jefferson High after his family moved to Aurora. Alex was struggling with anxiety and social isolation, feeling overwhelmed by the transition to a new school and the pressure to live up to his older cousin's academic achievements. Marcus had been working with Alex for several months, helping him develop coping strategies and build connections with other students. The process had been slow and sometimes frustrating, but Marcus could see signs of progress in Alex's increased confidence and improved academic performance. "You've taught me that it's okay to ask for help," Alex had told Marcus during one of their recent sessions. "My family always emphasized being strong and independent, but you've shown me that real strength sometimes comes from admitting when you need support." Conversations like this one reminded Marcus why he had chosen to dedicate his career to working with young people. Every student he helped represented not just an individual success story, but also the potential for positive ripple effects that could extend far beyond the immediate situation. As Marcus prepared for his move to California and his new role as a university professor, he reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken since that day in the Pinewood Valley High School bathroom. What had started as a moment of self-defense had evolved into a lifelong commitment to justice, healing, and education. His father's teachings continued to guide him every day, reminding him that true martial arts were about much more than physical techniques. Carlos Rivera had understood that the greatest battles are often fought not with fists or weapons, but with compassion, wisdom, and the courage to stand up for those who cannot protect themselves. Marcus Rivera had become a warrior in the truest sense, fighting not for personal glory or revenge, but for the creation of a more just and compassionate world. His weapons were empathy and understanding. His battlefield was the human heart, and his victories were measured not in opponents defeated, but in lives transformed and communities healed. The quiet kid from Pinewood Valley High School had found his voice and was using it to ensure that no other young person would have to face their battles alone. In a world that often rewards aggression and dominance, Marcus had chosen a different path, proving that sometimes the most powerful strength comes from those who choose to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to transform pain into purpose. As he looked toward the future, Marcus knew that his greatest challenges and most meaningful victories still lay ahead. But he faced them with the confidence that comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and why your work matters. Carlos Rivera's son had become the man his father had always hoped he would be: a protector, a healer, and a light in the darkness for others who were still fighting their way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.